Hello and welcome. I'm Sally Yurkovich, Director of Educational Exchange and Special Projects at the American-Scandinavian Foundation. And it's my pleasure today to welcome you to a virtual discussion on race, identity, and belonging in the Nordic countries. This is part of an ongoing series of programs focusing on contemporary issues, sponsored by the American-Scandinavian Foundation. Today, our discussants include Elizabeth Löwe Hunter, who specializes in articulations of racism in a Western European raceless context, specifically Denmark. She examines discursive and material conditions for national belonging across race, gender, sexuality, nationality, and spatiality in the contemporary metropolis. Elizabeth is a Ph.D. candidate in African-American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, with the designated emphasis in women, gender, and sexuality studies. She earned her master's degree in cross-cultural studies from the University of Copenhagen and her BA in cultural encounters from Roskilde University. Jasmine Kelekay is a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology with an interdisciplinary emphasis in Black Studies. She is an American-Scandinavian Foundation Fellow and currently is a visiting researcher at the Center for Multidisciplinary Studies on Racism at Uppsala University and in the Department of Criminology at Stockholm University. Her work explores the relationship between racialization and criminalization, with a particular focus on constructions of Blackness, the social control of African diasporic communities, and the ways in which African diasporic people construct and enact counter-hegemonic identities and discourses in response to racial oppression. Susani Mahadura has become a household name in Finnish media through her award-winning national radio program, Mahaduri and Ösberkan, which focuses on social and political issues in Finnish society. Ms. Mahadura and Jasmine Ösberkan were awarded the Red Cross Prize for Courageous and Uncompromising Journalism in 2018. Her first film was a short animation which tells the director's mother's love story. The film was shown at the Artova Festival, where it won the Audience Prize, and was shown also at the Helsinki International Film Festival in 2014 and 2015, with further screenings in India, China, and Germany. Susani has also appeared as a narrator on the 24H Europe, a project a documentary film about young people in Europe, which was one of TV history's longest documentaries. And last, but certainly not least, our moderator today is Ethelene Whitmire. Ethelene is a professor and chair of the Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's an American-Scandinavian Foundation Fellow, a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Copenhagen, and a recipient of grants from the Lois Roth Endowment and Scan Design for research related to her current research project, African Americans in 20th Century Denmark. She is the author of Regina Anderson Andrews' Harlem Renaissance Librarian. Today, the discussion we are grateful to the General Council of Finland in New York for their sponsorship of today's discussion, and look forward to hearing our panel. Ethelene?
Thank you so much. We will talk for 45 minutes and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Feel free to type in questions in the chat. I'm very excited to start this. And my first question is, how would you describe the different ways people talk about race in the Nordic countries? You can think about how does this differ depending on the group being discussed, whether they're Black, Middle Eastern, Sami, Roma, or their status as immigrants, indigenous, first generation, second generation, refugees, or even expatriates. So who would like to begin?
Well, I can begin. So yeah, first, my name is Elizabeth, and right now I'm actually located in Copenhagen. And I think it's important to just situate myself and say that I'm born and raised here. And I do this study in the US. So right now I'm here for research, and I ask this question myself. So I begin with having no answer because I also ask this, but I think it's one of the very important things is actually to make these kind of distinctions that you suggested, which is to say that the very scarce scholarship on that focuses race, which is also done by minoritized Danish people, so far is doing the very important task of actually identifying whiteness, which is very much silenced and invisibilized. However, I think it's very important to also not only look at what people are not white, all of the different brown people, but actually make those distinctions. I don't know that we know that yet, or I don't know that yet, but I think it's super important, and I'm curious to hear what is going on in Finland in that regard.
So yeah, well, Finland, I'm really excited, first of all, to be part of this discussion because it's really interesting to hear how the situation differs in other Scandinavian or Nordic countries. I thought about this question, and as a storyteller and a journalist, I have to go back to the year 2015. Koko Hubara, she's a writer, and she is kind of the mother, can we say so, of the discussions about race and identity in Finland. She founded a blog in 2015 that was named Brown Girls. And she started telling her experiences. And for me, as a journalist, as a storyteller, it was something amazing because I had never ever before that heard people talking about their experiences as people of color living in Finland. And in 2017, Koko actually founded the Brown Girls Media, which was the first media in Finland made by people of color to people of color. And that was a whole game changer, I believe, because before that, before 2017, 2015, we didn't even have words to describe the realities in which people actually live here in Finland. I didn't know what to call myself even. We had the word immigrant, which was, they used the word immigrant to tell everybody's story. I was born and raised in Finland, so that doesn't make me an immigrant, of course, but that's the reality. We haven't had words, and we are at the phase now where we are actually, are getting Finnish words to describe realities. So I think we are in the beginning of something, very big. I feel like the society is changing now, but let's say that it's been a path of 6 years, so quite short.
Just to add to what folks already said, I think it's really interesting to hear kind of different entry points into this. And for me, I'm in a kind of odd situation as well. I was born and raised in Finland, but I'm also of Swedish descent and live in Sweden. So I kind of work and know both contexts. And, I think what's really been highlighted is that, there is no uniform way to talk about this. In fact, there's a lot of time and energy spent in political, public, academic, popular discourse to not talk about it, right? To talk around race in all kinds of ways, whether that's by reference to immigration, to ethnicity, or the equating of race with ethnicity, with skin color, with religion, with culture, with language, and so forth. So that's kind of this erasure that, as scholars of color have long pointed out, kind of stems from this sense of Nordic exceptionalism, whereby they think race and racism is not relevant here. At the same time, I also really want us to remember that when we think about, the firsts, even for example, in the case of Kokahubara and brown girls in Finland, they're only the firsts if we're looking at people who are the descendants of migrants. Roma folks have, for hundreds of years, been producing content and organizing for Roma by Roma. So have indigenous peoples in Finland, Sweden, Norway, and people still living in, the Faroe Islands, Greenland, right? Territories still ruled by Denmark. So I think it really matters what we're talking about. I think that's one of the issues with sort of how people of color as a frame has kind of landed in the Nordics, and that one, we don't tend to really think about these connections, this bridge building between indigeneity, between Roma communities who are not immigrant communities, right? And then thinking about the sort of more recent descendants of people from the global South. And even there, I would still like to posit that I think Black communities have been talking about this, even in popular culture, much before, in the case of Finland, for example, before even Kokahubara did, but it wasn't recognized because it was done through sort of cultural production that is sidelined as not legitimate, right? If you don't have an academic degree, if you're not published and backed by sort of cultural institutions, if it comes through hip hop or social media or other sort of marginalized cultural forms, then it's kind of neglected. But I think when it comes to Black communities, I at least see in both Finland and Sweden that there is a longer history of at least talking about Blackness and Africanness in this diasporic sense. At the same time, as folks also point out, there's a massive difference in kind of where we are with that. Black articulations of Blackness and other racialized identities are much more prominent in Sweden, for example, and how there's organizations that have been there for much longer. For example, in Sweden, we saw the establishment of the National Association of Afro-Swedes 30 years ago, where in Finland, this is still nowhere to be found, really. So there are also huge differences that I think depend on the local particularities of the local context.
Mm-hmm.
A somewhat related question, but what does it mean to belong in the Nordic region? And to what extent do you think people of color feel they belong, or even you specifically?
Well, I could start, and it's definitely, as Jasmine, as you said it, and I was talking about my perspective as a journalist. For me, the game changer was kind of the brown girl media that gave me words to describe the reality where I was living, and that's affected the national broadcasting company of Finland, of course, and it has brought conversations to big arenas where we start talking about, exactly as you said, we have the Roma, we have the Sami, and we have hundreds of years of discrimination and racism in Finland, and now we are kind of waking up to the whole picture of it. And well, do people belong? That is a difficult question. I thought about it, and I thought about my father's story, and as a storyteller now, I feel like this is the time when we should focus on our ancestors, our parents, their parents' stories. Did they feel like they belong? They fought for their place, for justice in the society. And I feel like this is the time where we have to focus on these stories. And well, Finland, according to a EU study, is one of the most racist countries in Europe, compared to even to Sweden and Denmark. So belonging means to me feeling at home. When you walk out your house, you don't have to think about your identity. But the reality still in Finland is that you have to think about it. We have studies where we know that if you have a foreign name that's not regarded as being Finnish, it's more difficult for you to apply for a job, get an apartment, and so on. So we've got huge problems, institutional racism, and I feel like we have to tackle this problem, and it's only after that we have the opportunity for people to actually feel like they belong here.
Yeah, I think that's a really tough question. I mean, I don't know really what it means to belong. I think Susani had some kind of great points about this idea that seems like almost a fantasy, right, for people of color here. The idea that you could just walk outside your door and not think about, you know, who you are and how you stick out or what that means. You know, I can say for me personally, it's something I really struggle with and was one of the reasons I chose to leave, right? And as you know, Elizabeth, I know at least you share this experience of kind of going back and forth between, like, you know, feeling Nordic when you're not here, and then when you're here, you don't feel like you are. And so this in-betweenness and kind of hybridity there. So that is certainly a thing. And I want to say one thing about that in terms of even how we talk about these communities, these populations. One of the things that I think is so interesting is we talk about, you know, how in the US there's long been, you know, the kind of one drop rule of hypo descent, one drop black and you're black, right? I feel like here there's this kind of other rule of hypo descent that comes with having any heritage outside the boundaries of Europe, or at least the global South, right? Where we talk about first, second, third, fourth generation immigrant, because that is still how you need to be framed, right? Where you can't really become this kind of hyphen citizen, right? The way that, even though like people talk in this way and are naturalizing it in some way, doesn't really seem to be reflected in society. So the question of who feels like they belong, I think, is still very much open. I do want to say though that there are absolutely, you know, movements and people, cultural figures as well, who have been really adamant and unapologetic about carving out space for themselves and about talking about how they belong. You know, when we think about sort of, I work in to some extent in cultural studies, and when we look at somebody like Erik Lundin, a Black rapper in Sweden, who made a big deal of sort of claiming Swedishness, making a new kind of Swedishness. What does it mean to claim that and to say it can look like this, and it doesn't have to respond to what white people's sense of Swedishness is. It doesn't have to be about explaining where I'm from. It doesn't have to be this in-betweenness. It doesn't have to be all these things that are done to us or these positions we are put in, but we can define it as something new, this kind of third culture kid, I think, kind of mentality. So there are, I think, different ways that people are starting to navigate this and starting to articulate different ways of belonging and being. And I think that's only going to keep increasing and get more and more interesting with sort of further generations.
Yeah, I'll just add to what both of you have said with regards to belonging to the national community, and I think I completely agree with everything you said, and I think I want to explore that part of the question that you raised, Jasmine, with the possibility of actually feeling belonging and how those communities are created and how we can focus on creating that sense of belonging, which I understand as recognition, being seen, being heard, on our own terms, right? So, and that also goes back to this lack of words that many generations experience. How can we articulate who we are and who we want to be outside of this kind of like talking back to the norm or being always only existing as a response to, right? How can we be proactive and say, this is my name or this is who I am, outside of that, like I'm non-white. No, what are you? Who are you, right? It's complicated, but it happens in little glimpses, right? So how do we create more of that?
Yeah, these answers are so wonderful. I have so many follow-ups, but I'll stick with the script. Though I'll skip number 3, it's similar to, maybe come back to that, but number 4 is interesting too. And actually I met Elizabeth at a Black Lives Matter gathering in Denmark when the founder of the American or movement, one of the founders, Opal Tometi, was in Copenhagen. In what ways has Black Lives Matter movement resonated with people of color in the Nordic region? I was amazed on social media to see the gatherings in Copenhagen last summer, the massive gatherings. To what extent are issues it raises different or similar to Black people in Scandinavia? So in what ways does Black Lives Matter movement resonate in Scandinavia? Anyone, you could go in any order.
Well, I know Jasmine has been organizing this past summer, right? So maybe you want to go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting that this question is coming up so much now, because I think this is kind of when the world is starting to recognize that it's had an impact here. But I would like to say that, I mean, I think at least Black communities in both Finland and Sweden have been organizing and inspired by Black Lives Matter for many years now. This was not the first time this summer. It was just the first time that I think more non-Black folks showed up and responded to things, talking to activist friends in Helsinki, where, we for the first time had like a 3,000 people physical protest shortly after the killing of George Floyd. And they were saying that, back in 2016, when they organized the same thing, they had, 15 people show up, right? So I think it's not so much that this is a unique moment, I think, necessarily for people who are active with these questions, but it's more that like the rest of society is finally responding, right? Media finally cares and is interested in exploring these issues. And that is in part, I think, because of the organizing that has already been going on for the last several years, in part inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement. I've been doing ethnographic research in Stockholm and the rest of Sweden with Black activists, and a lot of people, have talked about the different ways in which the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement, it's not that it started Black activism and Black kind of political consciousness in Sweden, but it altered it in some ways, right? And maybe sharpened some of the tools that were used. And so I think it's because of this, because, for example, in Sweden, people have been documenting police brutality for several years now through the use of, mobile camera phones and social media. It's because of all that momentum that had been built, right? Because of the Black social movements that already existed, the organizations that existed, that when the moment of 2020 came, they were able to roll out, I think, on a much bigger scale. So I definitely think that the Black Lives Matter movement has, in that sense, provided kind of an opportunity for some people to kind of take advantage of the momentum and really get heard in new ways. But at the same time, as I'm seeing some of the things people posting in the chat here, it's also one of those cases where I think the majority of society, especially kind of the white hegemonic structure, right, is very happy to talk about Black Lives Matter and racism in the US. And talk about, how we need to care about that, but unwilling to really look at home, right? That's even, we saw this, I did a bunch of interviews for Finnish media over the summer, and nobody talked about, the Black people who have been killed in Finland by police, right? That was not something that they even knew about, while they're happy to talk about it elsewhere. Politicians will say Black Lives Matter at the same time that they're instituting anti-Black policies in our backyards, right? So I think that the question of how much it really means or matters remains to be seen, of course, when the dust settles. But unfortunately, I think there's always a way in which power finds, a way to utilize the moment. Say, we're going to do some diversity trainings, we'll have some panels maybe, and then we can pat ourselves on the back and keep going. But hopefully people will be able to take advantage of this little window of time to make some more permanent change.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to say about this question. And I think, Jasmine, earlier you just briefly mentioned Nordic exceptionalism, but I think it's important to say out loud that these contexts that we are in and from, the idea of race is a non-idea. It's very, very controversial to even raise the idea that we should talk about that. Immigrants maybe, ethnicity maybe, but race is, at least in Denmark, if you want to talk about race, racialization, and racial differences, you will be called the racist. So those are the conditions. So when Black Lives Matter enters this kind of raceless context, what can it even mean, right? And so I think that what you also point out, Jasmine, is there's something convenient about the US American Black Lives Matter as a way to focus elsewhere. And we've seen this in Denmark also, that the local issues and the local violence will not get that same media attention, or that same be taken seriously in that same way, because it is unthinkable that racism is in fact an issue here. We do not have race. And so in that regard, I also think it's very, very important to locate what is it that we're talking about. So Black Lives Matter in the US can mean something because of a particular context and a particular history. What can Black mean in, first of all, a raceless country, but also in a context with a very, very different demographic, with a different history, with a very diverse immigrant and racially minoritized population. What can it even mean here? We do not have a box to tick in the census that identifies us in terms of race. So we cannot count the racial violence. And in that sense, we cannot prove that that actually takes place. So the category that exists right now to make a differentiation in Denmark, we have a category called non-Western and descendants of non-Westerns. Those are categories that are marked and that we can count. But there's a lot of gray zones of experiences with racism that cannot be proved in numbers and cannot be believed because of the racelessness.
And I think, I mean, the language again is so important, because we're starting to see, I mean, some of this data does exist. Some places, some researchers, right, are finding creative ways to do this. But I think because of the culture that we have, this is so built in, it's so automatic, so hegemonic, that even when you have research, for example, that's come out in Sweden, showing not that people of color have a harder time on the job market, but showing in fact that Afro-Swedish people, that there's anti-Black racism, right? That impacts Black Swedes in a different way than it does all other racialized peoples. Even when that sort of quantitative data has existed that shows that, you know, for example, an Afro-Swedish person has to have a PhD to earn the same amount as a non-Black person with a 3-year post-high school diploma, right? Even when this research comes out, it is ignored, right? It is not relevant because racism isn't relevant, or because we find other ways, right? If we talk about it in terms of immigration, it becomes culture. Well, maybe they just have a different culture, right? They're lazier. Even COVID, right, got kind of explained away, where to the point where people of color and Black people in particular in both Finland and Sweden were kind of blamed for their own deaths, blamed for being disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, when the data also shows that they're the ones who work in jobs where there's the highest death rate, right? But no, it becomes about religion, about culture, about misinformation, about this kind of, so there's kind of this discourse, right? Like, I think that's just there. And just to point out the thing you said about language too, you know, I remember there was a friend of mine who contacted me and was like, I'm so excited. I was just reading the newspaper and they actually used the word Black. And I looked at the article and I was like, yeah, but that's cool, but it's because they're talking about the US, right? If they were talking about Black folks here, they're still gonna say things like dark skinned, or, you know, they'll code it somehow as in, you know, people from Rinkeby, like whatever spatial coding, language, culture, whatever else they use. So even when we see this kind of shallow progress, as you sort of pointed out, Elizabeth, I think we need to really think about, like, what is it really we're talking about? And is this actually shifting the conversation forward?
It's exactly like Jasmine said, and Jasmine pointed that, well, we have a history of Afro-Finns in Finland that goes, you know, way far, for centuries. And it's just that we haven't told those stories. We've had Black activists here before last summer, but have they had the arena, the platform to talk? Not in the big medias, let's say so. And there is a big problem still that when we talk about issues of race or racism in Finland, what I witness as a journalist is that most of the time it's, you know, all white panel or white people discussing, having the discussions where there should be, you know, Afro-Finns telling, you know, their own stories. And but I feel like last summer in Finland, you know, with the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, there was 3,500 people, and we had the pandemic going on. And when I was there, it was kind of a moment when I thought that something is happening. If I look back a couple of years ago, we had Black Lives Matter demonstrations in Helsinki, but there were, like Jasmine, you said, 15 to 20 to 30 people. And now all of a sudden there was 3,500 people. That was for many people kind of like a historic moment, and there was hope that maybe finally now we get to this, to have the conversations we need to have. We have institutionalized racism in Finland. It's a big problem. We should address it right now. And I actually have here this book that was made, documents of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in Finland, No Justice, No Peace. And there's pictures of the demonstrations in Helsinki and all over Finland. And just looking at this piece, for me, having it here, it's a piece of history. It means so much. And if it's okay, I'm just going to read a short paragraph. Sara Balhas was one of the two girls in their 20s that organized this demonstration. And what Sara is saying here is that the unequal treatment of people of color has been a global disease for far too long. I organized the demonstration simply because I wanted to fight for what is right, for justice and equality, and the right to live without fear. The silence had continued for too long, to the point that my brothers and sisters in Finland needed to be heard. We needed people to listen to us, hear the pain, hear the struggles that we've gone through. It took two girls to start it, but it took 3,500 people to make it happen. So, you know, it was a moment. And like I said, Finland, if I compare it to Sweden and even Denmark, I feel like we are way behind the conversation that Sweden and Denmark have. Jasmine, do you agree that we still are, you know, taking baby steps? But I feel like now we are actually, you know, inviting people to have those conversations that we need to have in big platforms. And I feel like that is a game changer, totally.
This is fantastic. This is a hard question, but what do you see as the future of the conversation about race, identity, and belonging in the Nordic region? Yeah, are you optimistic? Yeah, where do you see things going after you talk about all this momentum?
I mean, I think I'm hopeful that, you know, right, like, I mean, even just thinking about what Susani was just saying about how even when you see these panels, these conversations taking place, right, it's not people like us who usually occupy these spaces. It's probably the first time, besides the one panel I co-organized with Elizabeth and some other Afro-Nordic folks, is the only time I've ever been in a context where we're talking about race in the Nordics, where I'm only talking, like, exchanging ideas with other people who experience racism in the Nordics. And I think that we need more spaces like this, right? And I think there are things I'm seeing in the conversation that make me hopeful. One of the things, right, is just seeing more conversation, more voices. But I also think, you know, we would talk sort of the comparison, right, between Finland and Sweden, for example. I think with more representation, there also comes more responsibility, and I think an evolution of the conversation. And I think one of the things I'm seeing in the conversation in Sweden is really like, well, what do we do with more space? Or is really representation the only thing? And what kind of representation do we want, right? One of the unfortunate things about when we just focus on that sort of question of the just getting access to spaces is well, how do people use that? For example, there are a lot of people that kind of ran with Black Lives Matter and profited from it in various ways that does not necessarily advance the struggle and certainly does not live up to sort of what the essence of the Black Lives Matter movement is about, right? So just because we might have Black faces or brown faces in high places does not mean that we're necessarily moving the conversation forward. So at the same time that I'm hopeful, because I think there'll be more of us in these positions engaging with these issues, I also think we have an important challenge ahead. I think there's going to be this moment of kind of crisis where we realize that just getting a foot in the door is not enough. We need to also organize and build coalitions and really think about the values that we want to espouse, right? Because we're so used to this kind of, you know, complete invisibility and being denied any access, that I think that almost primes us to either just kind of be grateful for any opportunity, right? Which is also still a really problematic power dynamic to be in, or then where you kind of get this really toxic crabs in a barrel kind of mentality where people feel like there can only be one of us at a time, only one voice, only one perspective. You know, I've heard a lot of people in the movement say, you know, don't ever disagree with another Black person in public. Like, we all need to have the same opinion, because otherwise, you know, white people are going to think this thing about us or that thing about us. And it's like, I understand where this is coming from, this strategic kind of essentialism, but it's not going to work in the long run, right? If we really want to be free and we really want to think about liberatory praxis in different ways, we have to find ways to keep the conversation pushing forward beyond just, you know, we're here, right? Beyond just being recognized. And not to mention that, you know, the whole game of just trying to gain recognition, even though that's important for a variety of reasons, I think we also need to move towards thinking about self-determination and creating our own language and our own experiences and our own institutions, where we don't always have to be in this position to respond, as Elizabeth said. So I think that there's immense hope, but I think that there's also immense challenge, because I don't think we've been pushed to think about these issues quite that deeply yet, because we've been so stuck, right, and just repeating the same basic conversation. So I don't know what you all think about that.
I very much agree with everything that you've said so far. And what comes back to me is this thing both of you mentioned with white diversity panels or white decolonial panels and so on. And the way I see it, it also connects to, again, the racelessness. And I should quote Theo Goldberg here, right, for the term racelessness, because there's a belief that is very much circulating that we're all the same. So in a Danish context, equality translates, in practice, translates very much into sameness. And so there's this idea that we're all the same. So if you highlight difference, that's bad, then you're the racist. And that also reflects back on, well, the knowledge production or representation. Because if we're all the same, well, everyone can do the same job. So this idea that we work with within feminist studies very much, in critical race studies, that it matters where you're positioned, positionality, that idea is meaningless within the dominating discourse, because, well, we're all positioned in the same way. So to argue that, well, we want to have our own panels, we want to teach our own courses, we want to talk about our issues instead of being talked about or being studied like exotic subjects, that idea has not found ground yet in my observation. So it is very much, well, there's some decisions to make, and I think we can do different kinds of work at the same time. So while it's, yes, it matters to be on certain panels within institutions sometimes, but creating our own spaces at the same time, I think is very, very important for the simple thing as our emotional and mental health, but also our actual productive and healthy and creative work. Be it creative or knowledge, right? Yeah, and so in that relation also, for me personally, and it's sort of a paradox, but I have found my Nordic and European peers talking about race and Blackness when I went to the US. So there is something about, okay, there's a language there. So we can name ourselves and we can place ourselves within departments that we cannot do. I see the few people that I know within academia in Denmark are placed in pretty random departments trying to do this type of work, and who are the advisors and who are the mentors and so on, right? Big question mark. So also having community and kinship outside of the institutions, and not always on the terms of, oh, well, recognition simply, right? I think that's very important, and that's also how I've come to this panel, and some of us have come to this panel because we look out for each other. And I want to name Dr. Issei Smythe for and thanking them for actually pointing the arrow towards some of us who do this work, but nobody knows we exist because half of us are in the US and the other half are in random departments, so we cannot find each other, right? So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Susani, do you?
I strongly agree with what Elizabeth and Jasmine said. And one of the things I've been thinking about lately, or we in Finland have been thinking about, is that, you know, it's not up to us to fix racism. It's now up to white people to discuss, you know, the racism that's, you know, it's not our kind of fault. Also, we are giving information many times for free. We don't get paid for educating people. So I feel like the next step is that we need to discuss whiteness and what it means, you know, in Finland, and go beyond the conversation of not seeing color, because that's still, I feel like in the media field at least, a big problem. And well, as a storyteller, as a journalist, I feel like the next step also would be important to look at who are in positions of power. You know, who are the journalists that are telling the stories? If I look at my YLE, the National Broadcasting Company of Finland, where I work, there is still a lot of work to do when it comes to representation of who are the journalists doing or telling the stories. And also one thing that I've been thinking about lately is that, because words matter, and with words we create the reality in which we live. I've heard a lot of colleagues telling me that, you know, they're afraid of talking about these issues. I don't know what words to say, you know, use. So then I would ask, you know, if you're a journalist that specializes in politics, you probably wouldn't go and interview the president or some politician and say, you know, I don't know how to talk about it. So it means that we really, really have to start looking at how we have done things, and educate the journalists, educate the people who are in positions of power, so they know how to be anti-racist. Because now it's kind of like, if you know, you know. If you don't know, then it's like, oh, I didn't know. And then you write something that is harmful, or something that could harm people. So I feel like we've been talking a lot in Finland. We've been having conversations, and then we need to take action now. We really need to, you know, address the institutions to kind of be really anti-racist and admit that we have issues. Racism is a problem in the Nordics, even though for many years we've been kind of like, you know, human rights. We take proud that Finland, you know, human rights are important for us. So, but what does it really mean, you know? And more storytellers, more artists, give space for people to do their work and pay them.
Right. Thank you so much. I have so many questions. I'm taking notes while I'm supposed to be listening too. So many good things you're all saying. But I'm going to open it up. Our chat has been blowing up. I hope Sally Jurkovic has been able to gather some questions. And I see a lot of compliments about how fantastic they thought the panel is. So
Right.
thank you.
And there's been some great sharing of resources too. So I hope that we'll be able to make the chat available to everyone. The recording of the discussion will be available both on YouTube and on the Scandinavia House website. So yes, it's hard to sort through all the questions and comments because there have been so many, but I'll try to pick out a few. What, if any, impact have official policies of assimilation aimed primarily at immigrants meant for racial identity and movements in the Nordic countries?
Well, it might kind of depend a little bit what you mean by official policies for assimilation. I mean, I'm thinking obviously the history of both the Roma and the Sami populations have been very heavily, it's a history of sort of very violent policing through the logic of assimilation, right? Which is why, you know, people talk about the cultural genocide of the Sami, or you can talk about the sort of forced assimilation of the Roma, as well as other you know, marginalized communities. But when it comes to immigrants and refugees, you know, that's another story as well. But I think certainly it looks a bit different in each context. But you know, in Sweden and Denmark, and starting now in Finland as well, there's a lot of talk of how, you know, integration has failed, and because there have been the creation of parallel societies, right? In Denmark, going as far as instituting policies that require children from immigrant communities to spend X number of hours per week outside those communities so that they would learn Danish values, right? We actually see this kind of forced removal. In Sweden, we've seen this shape incredible segregation. Some neighborhoods in Sweden cities are more segregated than neighborhoods in the United States, you know. And at the same time, what you see politicians talk about as the source of racism, or the source of racial inequality, I should say, is they're still talking the assimilation game. They're saying it's because these kids don't speak Swedish well enough, even though they're born here. It's because they don't understand Swedish culture and norms, right? This is the source of the problem. So I think it's really interesting I think that's a really important question that I think still is really under-examined, because so much of the discourse around racism in the Nordics is still focused on, one, this question of language, you know, debating that, two, around kind of maybe representation, and three, I think thinking about the sort of broader history, or thinking about racism as interpersonal. Without really thinking about it as structural, I don't think we've even begun to really understand and examine the way that policymaking has really influenced this. But one of the things I think about a lot is how in the United States, you know, we see the way that communities of color have been excluded from policies of the welfare state that was built to only accommodate white people. Whereas I feel like in the Nordics, there's some of that as well, the ways that people of color don't get access to the benefits of the welfare state. But there's also a way in which communities of color are kind of rendered, controlled, and punished and sort of suppressed through the welfare state. So thinking about policies around, you know, family reunification, around like migration control, around social services, housing, education, all of the ways in which I think we really need to investigate the ways in which policies are made in the Nordics that do have racist implications and that do produce racial inequality. It's not just something that happens, right? We just have racial inequality and it's about how we fix it. We also need to understand the genesis of those things. But so I'm hoping to see this type of work more in the future.
Another question. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I thought someone else had.
No, I was just going to say quickly that the education system in Finland also has been, or there have been discussions where, for example, if a brown or black kid wants to wants to be a doctor, the teacher would say that maybe it would be better for you to be a nurse or something, you know, kind of like a lower, so that you would really have chances at it. And that's a big discussion that we are having, that do children and students have the same opportunities to reach for what they really want to do? That I just wanted to add that to what Jasmine said.
Okay, another question. During the massive gatherings around Black Lives Matter, there were people commenting on the missing visibility of Black people whose lives might not have been seen. For example, the Mediterranean and Lampedusa. Do you think that the big visibility of Black Lives Matter was more about the trending of US events and not about increased awareness in the Nordic context?
In Denmark, I think that, as Jasmine also mentioned, there's been a momentum for the Black Lives Matter this summer, but also since 2016, I believe there's been Black Lives Matter organizing both demonstrations, but that's only that's just what we see, and then there's the actual work, and especially also I want to highlight Boalia Sørensen. The actual work is actually taking into account a lot of different people who are targeted and suffer from Danish legislation that excludes, well, non-Westerners or people without the right papers and so on. A lot of the people that are stopped and stuck in the detention centers. So that sort of that is actually a part of it, but maybe isn't so visible in the slogans, and obviously not at the demonstrations because people are incarcerated.
Absolutely. I would say, I mean, I think a lot of the stuff that you see from the outside, that's the stuff that you see on social media or in the media, right, as Elizabeth said, only captures these kind of big scale demonstrations, these things where you get sort of the majority to go along with things. But behind the scenes, there's a lot of work being done. And so certainly at these big demonstrations, there hasn't been an emphasis on local cases. It has been about sort of showing solidarity, right? In the most generous sort of interpretation, showing solidarity with the United States, and in the kind of most cynical interpretation, right, this kind of performative allyship. And so that's, I think, a very interesting thing. And I think a lot of the people who organize these demonstrations, it's interesting, were sort of newer activists or folks who hadn't been involved in movements prior. I saw this both in Finland and also all over Sweden, whereas the people who have been organizing both under the banner of Black Lives Matter, but also sort of in the spirit of Black Lives Matter for a longer time, were focused on maybe other things, doing the work, trying to use the momentum, but less focused on the sort of big, showy, I think, kind of protest. So I think it's a little bit of both.
Time will show. I'm looking at, you know, the next few years, what will actually happen? Are we going to see a real change, or is it just going to be talk? We are having conversation in the music field, in the film industry in Finland, where they actually are having big conversations, you know, where people are actually trying to change or make a change, and inviting Black artists to have the conversations that before, you know, just a year ago, there was a conversation in one of the most popular radio programs, and there were no Black artists involved that conversation. And now we are having conversations where actually Black artists are being invited and having the opportunity to take part in the conversations. But then again, like I said, I want to see, conversation is important, but I want to see the real change in positions of power. We need to see, people give space for Black artists, Black politicians, Black, musicians to be able to do their work.
Okay, one final question. About language, and it's a question of how does language fit into this situation? There was an observation that language has been used as a tool to restrict full participation in civic life. See local Finnish media for examples of how language requirements, especially in Finland, limit the Finnish talent pool of professionals.
This is very true. And it's something that in our radio program, Mahadura Ösbergan, we have been discussing for many years now. Do people have access to conversations and platforms? And I feel like, no, definitely not. And there is this kind of like, you have to be fluent in Finnish. I was taking part in this integration kind of like big event in Finland, and some of the panelists there said that, if you want to come to Finland, you have to learn the language. And then I was like, how about the researchers that come from the US or Australia that happen to be white, that don't have to learn Finnish to be able to work in the society. So again, there is this racist structure of who we demand to speak Finnish fluently and who doesn't have to. And yeah, that is a very big problem.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and to the point that, I have family members who have been in Finland for 30 years who don't have citizenship because they wouldn't pass the language test, right? I don't know. I mean, well, maybe I would, but even then, right? Even as somebody who's born and raised in Finland, if you're multilingual, for example, and your Finnish is not your dominant language, in my case, it was my fourth language, right? It wasn't like at the center of my world in any way. That already for me completely, I grew up with that idea that there was no future for me in Finland. There was no way I could do those things except, right, be cleaner, service industry, maybe in the arts, right? But that there was the formality of society was kind of completely closed off. And again, this is something that we see in the Swedish discourse completely weaponized now, right? Language, people not speaking good enough Swedish or the right type of Swedish is being sort of used as a tool to police, even when people are, right, again, where multilingualism is seen as a deficit rather than as maybe an asset. At the same time that, of course, businesses and all these other places want to privilege multilingualism in other ways. So it just depends on who you are. I also want to say, though, that when we think about language and access to language, there's also a different way, the language that we're using to even talk about this stuff. We talked a lot about, how we're kind of restricted and limited by the sort of mainstream white society. But I also want to keep in mind that, even the language that we're using around these issues is not accessible to all of our communities. This is something that I think about a lot, sort of coming from a working class community where, people of color, racialization, post-colonialism, like whatever jargon we use, whatever these kind of this context that we speak of these issues in is not necessarily, not only accessible, but not necessarily as relevant, right? Not because there isn't a discussion of these things going on, but because they're happening on different terms. So I also think that for us to really kind of have a more open and anti-racist conversation, it needs to be broadened as well, to not only sort of live in the terms of academia, but to really be more open. And to remember that these are communities that are extremely diverse, extremely multilingual, and that not having a shared language is not necessarily right, a weakness.
And I'd like to also to the accessibility aspect that you bring up, is that you say, what kind of language are we using to even talk about this? But as a matter of fact, we're speaking English also right now, right? So it's not only language use, but it's also what is the actual languages. And that's something that I think about a lot, that how come we in the Nordic countries are not speaking our own languages with each other when it's possible. Of course, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark could actually do that. We could have some live translation going on for Finnish, right? Why don't we do that? For me, it's very, very important. And Susani, you also mentioned this in the beginning. You don't have Finnish words necessarily to talk about these things and to name yourself. I observe in the Danish context that English is taking a lot of space. And some of the main terms to speak about this is in English if the whole event or the whole conversation is not entirely in English. There's something around that. How come we cannot speak back or construct ourselves in our first language? When I'm insulted in my first language, I would like to be able to speak back in my first language. But that is something that we have to construct right now. But I think it's very, very important. And also, if we broaden it a little more, how come the US American vocabulary takes up so much space in these little Scandinavian conversations that we have? We could be looking to Belgium, to France, to Germany, and so on. They're right next door, but we're looking all the way over there, right? So there's also a major imbalance of representation, the kind of popular culture and academic publications that we consume. It might be even closer to home, actually, to have these conversations with other Europeans, and especially with other Scandinavians. It's so alike. That's another aspect of that language question, but I think it's very, very central.
Great. Thank you. Well, unfortunately, we have to end the discussion now, but thank you, Elizabeth, Ethelene, Susani, and Jasmine, for a great discussion. We've had many, many wonderful comments and many words of thanks to you today, and we really appreciate it. As I mentioned earlier, the discussion will be available on YouTube as well as on the Scandinavia House website. Also, a note that until January 24th, Scandinavia House is presenting virtual cinema screenings of We Carry It With Us, The Fragments of a Shared Colonial Past, which is a documentary that investigates collective memory and different perspectives of the shared colonial past between Denmark and the US Virgin Islands. This is something that people may also be interested in watching. And then finally, this weekend is the end of the Nordic and Baltic Oscar contenders film series. So be sure not to miss that as well. Again, thank you to all of the panelists for participating today. And thank you to the General Consul of Finland in New York for helping support this interesting panel. We hope to be able to continue this series in the future, and ask you to keep an eye out on the Scandinavia House website for future presentations. Thank you.
Thank you all.